The lobby of the Rivermont Grand Hotel was a masterpiece of extravagance. Golden chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the marble floors polished to a mirror-like finish. The air smelled of fresh-cut orchids and aged leather, the subtle but unmistakable scent of wealth. A place where only the most privileged stepped through the doors, where money wasn't just expected, it was required. Ethan Langford strode through the entrance as if he owned the building. In his world, money meant control. And tonight, as he arrived at one of the most exclusive hotels in the city, he expected nothing less than perfection. The doorman greeted him by name, tipping his hat with practiced precision. The concierge, a man Ethan had met on countless business trips before, stepped forward with a welcoming smile, already reaching for the sleek leather folio containing Ethan's room key. "Mr. Langford, welcome back. Your penthouse suite is ready for you." Ethan barely acknowledged the man's words. Of course it was ready. He paid more per night than most people made in a year. His requests weren't just fulfilled, they were anticipated. He glanced around the lobby, scanning the other guests as he waited for his assistant to finalize the details. It was an old habit, sizing up the room, measuring people by their watches, their suits, the way they carried themselves. You could always tell who was truly wealthy and who was just pretending. And then, his gaze landed on someone who didn't fit. A man stood near the front desk, dressed in dark jeans, a simple black jacket, and worn-in boots that had clearly seen better days. He carried a single duffel bag slung over his shoulder, not the sleek, custom luggage of a man used to private jets and first-class accommodations. Ethan frowned. What was someone like that doing here? He had seen it before, people trying to fake their way into places they didn't belong, stretching their bank accounts thin just to brush shoulders with real wealth. It was always obvious, the way they hesitated at the desk, double-checking their cards, speaking politely to the staff as if afraid they might be thrown out at any second. This man, however, he didn't look nervous. He wasn't fidgeting, wasn't second-guessing himself. He stood there calm, unbothered, as if he had nothing to prove. And for some reason, that irritated Ethan. He turned back to the concierge, his voice sharp. "What kind of clientele are you letting in these days?" The concierge hesitated, following Ethan's gaze. "Mr. Langford." Ethan gestured subtly toward the man near the desk. "Him." His voice was laced with disdain. "I wasn't aware the Rivermont had started letting in anyone." The concierge stiffened slightly but said nothing. Ethan smirked, adjusting the cuff of his tailored suit. This was his world, and if this man thought he could walk in unnoticed, he was about to learn how things really worked. Keanu Reeves stood near the front desk, his posture relaxed, one hand resting on the strap of his well-worn duffel bag slung over his shoulder. The hotel lobby around him was a monument to excess, polished marble floors reflecting the glow of ornate chandeliers, gold-trimmed columns stretching toward a vaulted ceiling, hushed conversations carried out in a kind of measured elegance that only the wealthy perfected. And yet, he didn't seem out of place, not in the way someone trying to fit in might. He wasn't glancing around nervously, wasn't adjusting his clothes or shifting on his feet. He was just there, standing in line, waiting his turn, as if this were any other hotel, any other night, any other place. But to the people around him, he stood out. Not because they recognized him, not yet, but because he didn't belong. At least, not by their standards. The other guests waiting at the front desk were adorned in tailored suits and silk evening gowns, their shoes gleaming, their accessories subtle but undeniably expensive. Their wealth was a statement, a carefully curated image, one that told the world exactly who they were and where they belonged. Keanu, on the other hand, was an anomaly. The Faultex's black jacket was simple, his jeans comfortably worn. There was no luxury watch peeking from beneath his sleeve, no meticulously styled hair, no designer luggage trailing behind him. And that, more than anything, made people curious. The whispers started almost immediately. A woman in a red dress nudged her companion, her voice low but pointed. "Who just walks into a place like this dressed like that?" A businessman at the concierge desk cast a brief glance over his shoulder, his expression unreadable but interested. Even the front desk attendant hesitated for the briefest moment when Keanu stepped forward, as if she had expected someone else. Keanu, of course, noticed none of this, or if he did, he didn't care. He gave the attendant a polite nod, slipping his hand into his jacket pocket to retrieve his reservation details. No demands, no special requests, just a quiet, efficient check-in. Meanwhile, a few feet away, Ethan Langford was watching. His lips curled into a faint smirk, his head tilting slightly as he studied the man at the desk. This should be interesting, because in a place like this, status mattered. And to Ethan, this guy had none. Ethan Langford had always believed that wealth dictated worth. He had spent his entire life navigating rooms like this: five-star hotels, private clubs, invitation-only galas where money wasn't just a privilege, it was the unspoken rule of existence. The people around him, whether they admitted it or not, played the same game. They dressed the part, spoke in measured tones, and made sure their status was evident without having to say a word. That's why, when his gaze landed on the man in the black jacket and jeans standing at the front desk, his first thought wasn't curiosity. It was irritation. The guy had no presence. No air of importance. He didn't even have the kind of nervous energy that usually accompanied someone who was out of their depth. And that annoyed Ethan more than it should have. He wasn't sure what it was: the casual posture, the worn-in boots, the way the man seemed to move through the room without acknowledging the silent hierarchy at play. People like him didn't belong here. They shouldn't be able to walk into a place like the River Mont without proving they deserved it. And yet, here he was. Ethan's smirk returned as he turned slightly, making sure his voice carried just enough for the people nearby to hear. "Looks like someone's in the wrong hotel." His assistant, standing beside him, let out a small, forced chuckle. Others nearby glanced in his direction, sensing the start of something, their interest piqued. Ethan leaned against the check-in counter, pretending to examine his watch. A deliberate move, showing off the sleek, custom-designed piece on his wrist, one that cost more than most people's annual salary. "Guess they're just letting anyone in these days," he added, this time loud enough to ensure the front desk staff heard. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Others, sensing the opportunity to align with someone powerful, smirked just enough to let Ethan know they were on his side. The man at the desk, however, he didn't react. Ethan expected some kind of response: a glance, a shift in posture, maybe even an attempt to explain himself. But the guy just continued his check-in process, his expression unreadable. The lack of acknowledgement irked Ethan even more. People didn't just ignore him. "Hope you didn't max out your credit card for this place," he quipped, pushing the joke further, waiting for a flicker of embarrassment, for some sign that this man understood exactly where he stood. Instead, the man finally turned. Ethan was ready for a defensive remark, an excuse, anything that confirmed what he already believed, that this guy didn't belong here. But what he got was something else entirely. A small, amused smile, calm, controlled, unbothered. And for the first time, Ethan felt something he didn't expect. The faintest, smallest hint of doubt. Keanu Reeves had been in situations like this before. The arrogance, the smug glances, the way some people measured their worth by how small they could make others feel, it was nothing new. He had seen it in Hollywood, in business meetings, in high-end restaurants where money was mistaken for character. But that didn't mean it ever fazed him. So, when the man beside him, Ethan Langford, a name he didn't recognize but a type he had encountered countless times before, deliberately spoke loud enough to get a reaction, Keanu didn't give him one. Not the kind he wanted, anyway. Instead, he smiled. A small, amused smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes but carried just enough warmth to be disarming. Not defensive, not apologetic, just calm. He could feel the weight of the room shifting, the lingering gazes, the half-curious, half-entertained whispers from people who weren't sure whether to align themselves with Ethan or just enjoy the unfolding spectacle. Keanu let the moment breathe. Let the arrogance settle. Let Ethan's words linger in the air, waiting for a response that never came. And then, just as effortlessly, he shrugged. "Could be," he said simply, as if the entire exchange meant nothing to him. Ethan blinked. That wasn't how this was supposed to go. People stammered when he called them out. They laughed nervously, tried to justify themselves, prove they belonged. This guy, he just shrugged it off like it was nothing. That single, unbothered response did something that Ethan hadn't anticipated. It made him look ridiculous, because suddenly, it wasn't about this man not belonging. It was about why Ethan was so desperate to point it out. The people who had smirked at Ethan's initial comment now exchanged glances. The front desk staff, who had been cautiously avoiding eye contact, suddenly looked more uncomfortable with Ethan than they did with the man he was trying to mock. And worst of all, Ethan felt it. The shift, The subtle but undeniable realization that he had lost control of the moment. He opened his mouth, ready to double down to reclaim the dominance he was used to holding over a room. But before he could speak, the hotel manager appeared from around the corner, and everything changed. Ethan was just about to open his mouth again when a sudden shift rippled through the room. It started small, a hushed whisper from the concierge to a colleague. A sharp intake of breath from the front desk attendant, who suddenly looked mortified as she glanced toward the man Ethan had just insulted. Then the manager appeared, a man in his late 50s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that screamed decades of experience in catering to the elite. He moved with urgency, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor as he weaved through the lobby, his eyes fixed on one person. And it wasn't Ethan. The moment the manager reached the desk, he didn't hesitate. He didn't glance at Ethan. He didn't acknowledge the gathering stares. Instead, he turned to the man Ethan had just spent the last 5 minutes mocking, his expression instantly shifting from shock to something else entirely. Respect. Deep, genuine respect. Mr. Reeves, the manager breathed, his voice filled with both awe and regret. I am so sorry for the delay. If I had known you were checking in, we would have arranged for a much more private welcome. Ethan froze. The name landed like a thunderclap. Reeves, Keanu Reeves. The whispers spread instantly, a few gasps. Someone further back, a young woman near the bar, turned toward her friend with wide eyes. Oh my God, she whispered. That's Keanu Reeves. Ethan's stomach plummeted. The realization spread like wildfire. People who had barely noticed the exchange before were now staring openly. A couple in the lounge subtly reached for their phones, not to take photos but to text someone to spread the news. Because now, the entire room saw what had just happened. Ethan hadn't been mocking just anyone. He had been mocking one of the most respected, beloved actors in the world. A man known not just for his talent, but for his humility, generosity, and kindness. And worst of all, Keanu hadn't even needed to reveal it. He could have name-dropped himself the second Ethan had started talking. He could have shut him down in one sentence. But instead, he had let Ethan dig his own grave. And now, Ethan was buried in it. A bead of sweat formed at his temple as the stares turned against him. The smirks that had accompanied his first insult were now gone. And then, someone in the crowd spoke, not loudly, not dramatically. Just a simple question that sealed Ethan's fate. Do you even know who that is? The words hung in the air like a knife. Ethan had never wanted to disappear more in his life. Ethan had spent his entire life commanding attention. Rooms shifted around him, not the other way around. Conversations bent in his direction. People laughed at his jokes, even when they weren't funny. But now, he was invisible. The moment Keanu's name was spoken, everything changed. The front desk attendant who had been neutral just moments ago now looked mortified, her hands slightly trembling as she typed furiously into the computer, trying to speed up Keanu's check-in. The hotel manager, once composed and dignified, had turned into a flurry of nervous energy. Mr. Reeves, he said again, voice filled with reverence as he gestured to a waiting concierge. Please, allow me to personally escort you to your suite. We'll upgrade you to the presidential at no additional charge, of course. Keanu, still calm, still effortlessly unbothered, simply offered a small, polite smile. That's not necessary, he said. But now the entire staff was falling over themselves to make up for their mistake. We insist, the manager replied quickly, bowing slightly. We deeply regret any oversight in your check-in experience. Your privacy and comfort are our top priority. And Ethan was no longer part of the conversation. The people who had once smirked at his jokes were no longer looking at him. Their focus was entirely on Keanu, not just out of admiration, but out of sheer embarrassment for having been complicit in the moment that had just unfolded. A woman nearby, elegantly dressed in designer heels and a diamond necklace, suddenly stepped forward. Mr. Reeves, she said, offering a hand, her tone completely different from the dismissive murmurs she had exchanged with her companion earlier. It's such an honor to meet you. I just have to say, I'm a huge fan. That was all it took. Suddenly, everyone wanted to speak to him. A businessman, one of Ethan's peers, casually made his way over, pretending it was coincidence. Keanu, he said, the fake familiarity dripping from his voice. Wow, I wasn't expecting to see you here. We actually have some mutual friends in LA. What brings you to the Rivermont? Keanu gave the same polite nod, shaking the man's hand, but his expression remained unreadable. A younger couple near the bar whispered excitedly before finally mustering the courage to approach. "Would you mind if we got a photo with you?" Keanu didn't seek attention, but now that the room had shifted, it followed him effortlessly. And Ethan was drowning in silence. No one was looking at him anymore. No one was laughing at his jokes. The moment that had begun as his victory lap had turned into his most humiliating defeat. Even his own assistant, who had laughed dutifully at every remark just minutes ago, now looked uncomfortable, shifting awkwardly beside him. Ethan clenched his jaw, his pulse pounding in his ears. How had this happened? He had spent his life ensuring he was always the most important person in the room. But now, in the span of a few minutes, he had been reduced to background noise. And worst of all, Keanu wasn't even trying. That realization burned more than the humiliation itself. Ethan Langford had never been ignored before. His entire life, he had been the center of every room he entered. People listened when he spoke. They laughed at his jokes, even when they weren't funny. They respected him, or at least pretended to. But now he was standing in the middle of the five-star hotel he had always considered his domain, and no one was looking at him. Not one person. It wasn't just that they were focused on Keanu. It was how they were focused on Keanu. Admiration, respect, genuine interest. Ethan had spent his life buying admiration. Keanu Reeves, he didn't have to. And that was the moment Ethan felt it. The realization hit like a freight train. He had humiliated himself, not just in front of a few people, not just in some small, private way he could recover from. No, this was public. The entire hotel lobby had witnessed it. The staff, the guests, the wealthy socialites who would carry the story beyond these walls, were telling it with mocking smiles at future events. His peers, the same men who had once laughed at his jokes, would now laugh about him. Because in a room full of people who spent their lives pretending to be powerful, he had just exposed himself as desperate. And Keanu hadn't even needed to fight back. That was the worst part. He hadn't thrown an insult. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't even needed to defend himself. He had just stood there. Ethan had done all the damage on his own. His mouth was dry. His palms felt clammy, a cold sweat creeping along his spine. He needed to fix this. But how? How do you recover from publicly making a fool of yourself? There was only one option: swallow his pride and apologize. Ethan could feel the walls closing in. The weight of his own arrogance pressed down on him, heavier than the stairs now burning into his back. The same people who had once hung on his every word, who had smirked at his insults minutes ago, now wouldn't even meet his eyes. He needed to fix this. He forced a laugh to loud, to forced to hollow. "Hey, come on," he said, waving a dismissive hand as if this was all some big joke. No hard feelings, right? No one laughed with him. The room was too quiet. Keanu, still standing calmly by the front desk, simply tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak, he didn't react, he just waited. And that was the problem. Ethan had spent his life winning by controlling the narrative. But now he had lost that power. The silence dragged. The longer it stretched, the more desperate Ethan became. The laughter had failed. His reputation was slipping through his fingers. He had to try something else. He swallowed, his throat dry, and took a step forward. "Look, man," he cleared his throat, forcing a smile that no longer carried any confidence. "I didn't mean anything by it, just having a little fun, you know?" Still, Keanu didn't respond. A bead of sweat formed at Ethan's temple. This wasn't working. He glanced around, looking for some kind of support, anyone to back him up. But even his own assistant, the same man who had laughed at his side all evening, was now standing stiffly, eyes averted, as if he wanted no part in what was happening. Ethan turned back to Keanu, his stomach twisting. He needed to end this. "I'm serious," he said, his voice lower now, forced into something that resembled sincerity. "I didn't mean any disrespect. If I had known," he stopped himself too late, "if I had known who you were." The words weren't spoken, but they hung in the air anyway. Because that was the truth, wasn't it? He hadn't been sorry when he thought Keanu was a nobody. He hadn't been sorry when he mocked him in front of a crowd. He wasn't really sorry now. He was just sorry he had been wrong. Keanu exhaled softly, then finally spoke. You don't need to apologize to me. The words were simple, calm, but they carried weight. Ethan blinked. What? Keanu shrugged. You should apologize to yourself. The room was dead silent, because everyone understood exactly what he meant. Ethan wasn't embarrassed because he had hurt someone. He was embarrassed because he had been exposed. And that was something no apology could fix. Keanu didn't stay angry. He didn't need to. There was no reason to humiliate Ethan further. Ethan had already done that himself. The hotel staff still hovered nearby, eager to make amends for their mistake. Guests who had once ignored Keanu now stood in silent admiration, watching the exchange unfold like something out of a film. But Keanu had no interest in victory. He had always believed that true character wasn't revealed in grand gestures or empty words, but in the smallest moments and how you treated the people you thought didn't matter. And tonight, Ethan had shown the entire room exactly who he was. Keanu exhaled softly, looking at the man who had spent the entire evening trying to prove his own superiority. Ethan stood frozen, still processing the weight of the moment, still desperate for a way to undo what had already been done. Keanu could have walked away right then, left him there, drowning in the embarrassment of his own making. But instead, he gave him something far worse. A lesson. Keanu's voice was calm, steady. No anger, no arrogance, just truth. The way you treat people when you think they're beneath you says more about you than them. Silence. Ethan flinched as if the words had physically struck him. Because this wasn't just about tonight. This was about who he was. All his life, he had built himself up by stepping on others. He had dismissed, belittled, and ridiculed people who couldn't offer him anything because he had never considered that they mattered. But now, the entire room had watched him crumble in the face of someone who hadn't even fought back. Keanu gave him one last look, measured, unreadable, before finally turning away. Ethan's throat was dry, his mind scrambling for something, anything to say that could fix this. But there was nothing, because Keanu had already said everything. By the next morning, the damage was done. The hotel incident had spread like wildfire. Someone had recorded the exchange, and within hours, it was everywhere. News articles, social media posts, viral memes. Ethan Langford's humiliation was no longer confined to the walls of the Rivermont Grand. It had gone global. The headlines were brutal. CEO tries to humiliate Keanu Reeves, ends up begging for forgiveness. Billionaire learns the hard way, Keanu Reeves is untouchable. When humility beats arrogance, Keanu's calm response goes viral. Comment sections were relentless. Imagine thinking you could embarrass Keanu Reeves. Bro embarrassed himself. Rich people like Ethan spend their lives trying to impress other rich people. Keanu doesn't have to try, and that's what drives them crazy. Keanu owns motorcycles, gives away millions, and rides the subway like a normal person. Ethan thinks a hotel lobby is his kingdom. There's levels to this. Ethan had spent his life controlling narratives, curating his reputation, ensuring that people only saw what he wanted them to see. But now, he was the punchline. He tried to spin it. His PR team scrambled to release a carefully worded statement, something about how we all have moments we're not proud of, and how he had deep respect for Mr. Reeves. No one bought it, because the damage wasn't in what he had said. It was in what it had revealed. Ethan had always believed that money dictated power. That control meant making others feel smaller. But Keanu had proven him wrong. And Keanu had already moved on. While the internet feasted on the story, while think pieces dissected the moment, while Ethan scrambled to recover from his public downfall, Keanu did what he always did. He went on with his life. No victory lap, no gloating, no need to rub it in. Because real power isn't in status, money, or dominance. It's in character. And that's something Ethan Langford could never buy.